the Switch 2 has secrets. Maybe. Nintendo Switch 2 was just revealed, and I'm so hyped. It's literally everything the rumors have been saying it will be, and that's perfectly fine with me. The Switch 2 doesn't need to be anything more than just a more powerful Switch, so I'm glad they're changing up a few more things here and there to make the console look novel, while keeping the main idea of what the Switch is. A hybrid console that can dock to the TV or take on the go. Really, as far as I'm concerned, that's the perfect gimmick, and frankly, I don't see them changing that anytime soon. However, there are a lot of people disappointed by the reveal, or at least underwhelmed, and I totally get that. After all, it does at face value just look like a bigger Switch with a different attachment system. Not to mention it's taken 8 whole years to get this upgrade, after 4 years of rumors about some sort of Switch Pro. People were used to Nintendo really pushing cool gimmicks and innovating on previous consoles, so it's not too much to get excited over. The name is Switch 2, so the console is very iterative by design. Not to mention that the leaks basically sort of mentioned everything that was in this trailer. If you didn't care too much about graphics and starting frame rates, you're likely not going to be convinced to buy a new system with only slightly bigger controllers. At least at first glance. There's definitely more to this console because there's a bit in the trailer that went slightly unnoticed, at least in more general spaces. Plenty of Nintendo YouTubers have talked about it already, but when the Joy-Cons attach into the grip, they start sliding on the table, almost as if it's like a mouse? That's right. In fact, there's an optical sensor right there. It looks exactly like the optical sensor on a mouse, and I think that's like revolutionary. Shooters, tabletop RPGs, especially Mario Maker type editor games, will be greatly enhanced by a feature like this. I could make a whole video about it, but I think Carlos said it pretty perfectly. Also, this was just a hardware reveal. This can only show so much when it comes to internal components and gimmicks. I mean, could you honestly tell me with a straight face that the Switch had a hardware reveal? That you'd be able to tell there's HD rumble or an IR sensor on it? Or that the button on the left would be a capture button? Because this is Nintendo, I do have a feeling we're being slightly presumptuous about what this console will be. And in fact, I have a list of 5 things that this console could still have as gimmicks that would be impossible to see from a hardware reveal, and that would be truly mind-blowing. So mind-blowing in fact that it becomes the new innovation, and companies will try to copy Nintendo yet again in the race to the top. Of course, just keep in mind, this is all speculation, so don't get your hopes up. But this is my 5 gimmicks Nintendo Switch 2 could still have. With the introduction of a mouse sensor on the Joy-Con, moving around a cursor in games is going to be extremely intuitive and much better to play with. The possibilities just get me so giddy. Mouse in combination with the joystick has never really been a key way to play games before, but Nintendo might be able to bring it into the limelight and make it a fundamental new way to play games. Possibly even leading on to new capability with PC games. However, there's a feature on a mouse that a lot of people don't give that much credit to. Obviously, I'm talking about the scroll wheel. With the flick of your index finger, you're scrolling through inventory objects, web pages, tabs. All sorts of intuitive item management is so much easier with a much quicker way to scroll right to the thing you want. There's actually precedent that Nintendo had thought about putting a scroll wheel on a controller before. Patents came out all the way back in 2015, when the NX was still a mystery and no one knew what it was. In the patent, they showed off a design that incorporated the scroll wheels into the shoulder buttons, that allowed for clicky haptics and could possibly be used for said inventory management. People were actually pretty excited for this idea, but it seemed Nintendo couldn't quite figure out how to make it work with other components of the Switch, and it was since not incorporated, obviously. Patents are not always something that makes its way into the real product, but it does give us insight into what Nintendo and other companies are thinking about at any given time. This is the part where you may be thinking, so what? They obviously didn't put a scroll wheel on this controller either. What are you talking about? Is this clickbait? And to that I say, yeah, they didn't. But you don't need a scroll wheel to introduce scrolling capability. The Apple AirPods have an extremely interesting tech on them, one that allows you to turn up or down the volume with just a swipe of your finger. This is through a capacitive touch that senses which direction your finger is swiping. If the Switch 2 incorporated this design into its Joy-Con shoulder buttons, allowing the shoulder buttons to be used just like a scroll wheel, it would be a game changer, while not having to change basically anything about the original controller design, and it fixed quite a few games already. Tears of the Kingdom and Echoes of Wisdom are both notorious with inventory management, having to scroll long rows of items. A scroll wheel would be a perfect way to actually bring some purpose to this new equipment system design. Do I have any evidence of this? No, not really. Again, this is all speculation, and Nintendo hasn't said anything about wanting to incorporate something like this in the Switch 2. However, there's two reasons I think it's very likely. For one, Nintendo experimented with the concept before. They were thinking about how it could work and what they could do with it long before anyone else. Apparently, Ken and Krista also heard they were thinking about using magnets to attach Joy-Cons all the way back then too. That means ideas are never dead in the water. If Nintendo's bringing back a feature that's completely reminiscent of the mouse, what better time is it to bring the scroll wheel back from the dead? Another reason is look at the Switch 1 shoulder button. Now look at the Switch 2 shoulder button. Notice anything? It's massive! Like if the ratio of the button stayed in size to the bigger form factor, the size would still be half of what we got. Why would we ever need a shoulder button that big in the first place? Unless of course we need a lot of space to move our index finger. It probably doesn't mean anything as well, but I wanted to mention it. Sakurai was and still is kind of trying to push the idea as a possibility. He thinks that there would be a reason to add it. If this were introduced, I think Nintendo would be able to execute it extremely well, and it could become the next controller innovation since dual-stick controls. Nintendo has always pioneered the controller, so they've absolutely got it in them to go wild. Speaking of pioneering a brand new type of controller. Alright, brace yourself. There's some big words coming in this one. When Nintendo released the Nintendo Switch, one feature they really pushed hard was HD Rumble, where you could feel the water feeling the glass, or feel the marbles rolling around in a box. Things that, while cool, were a tad overhyped. I mean, it's kinda cool to feel the marbles, but otherwise it's just a neat little gimmick of the controller that didn't really do much in the end. Mario Kart uses it to some extent, but not to anything crazy, realistic feeling. But Nintendo still clearly loved their idea with this innovation, and I could totally see them pushing out a sort of new version of this idea in the brand new Joy-Con. This brings me to a patent filed as an update in 2023 that talks about something extremely intriguing. Now bear with me, this sounds crazy, but it's not that hard to understand, yet the implications of the tech could indeed be absolutely insane. Magnetological fluid is a material, essentially two magnetic surfaces, that when put together simulate resistance when pushed, like an analog trigger for instance. This would give the joystick a possible resistance that could be felt when pushed in a certain direction. This is cool in of itself, like racing games would be way more immersive with a controller like this. However, the idea goes even further than this. In the patent, it talks about information states and communication with the controller, stating that the circuit is capable of performing switching between the first state and a second state. The circuit is configured to, in the second state, control the magnetic field generation section so that the viscosity of the magnetological fluid becomes a first viscosity. In another configuration example, the first viscosity may be such a viscosity that allows the position of the operation element to be displaced, and a second viscosity may be such a viscosity that the viscosity of the meteorological fluid serves as a resistance that substantially does not allow the position of the operation element to be displaced. Essentially, information could transfer to the controller and possibly control the resistance you feel in the joystick at any given time. With the right application, this could introduce a whole new dimension to controller input. This could introduce viscosity, a resistance that transforms depending on what's going on the screen. It would fall perfectly in Nintendo's vision of how they wanted to change up the controller. As Miyamoto stated in the 2019 shareholders meeting after E3, he said that our objective is to achieve an interface that surpasses the current controller, where what the player does is directly reflected on the screen, and the user can clearly feel the result. Introducing a whole new element of resistance in the controller based on what's reflected on the screen would essentially be a direct reflection of the result of the occurrence on the screen. This is a bit of a conspiracy theory, but it could also be why the initial Switch 2 trailer showed that one shot where the joystick was moving around like that. We already know what a joystick is and does, so I have a feeling there's more being added to that joystick than meets the eye if they're gonna focus on it so much. If this is done right, I think this could be the next HD Rumble, except this tech would feel downright futuristic. Imagine if in the next Mario Kart you could feel the wind push the controller in a certain direction. Imagine if on an ice level you could feel the slipperiness of the joystick. Or if you get stuck on a mud path, you had to really push out of the mud. These are only some of the examples I could think that could push this next controller into a realm of its own. This would be absolutely mind-boggling and push for people to get a hands-on experience as soon as possible. Alright, let's dial things back a bit because we're really in dreamland right now, you could say. These things that I'm mentioning have positively no precedent in being included in this console in the slightest. They're just fun ideas that Nintendo had thought about at one point in time. Why don't we move on to something a little more concrete? Something we already know exists, but we don't know its implications. There's an interesting button on the new Switch 2, a button that looks like nothing in the hardware reveal. Nintendo clearly blanked this button out, as they're not yet ready to reveal it. Yet if all the leaks are right, and they all have been right so far, then we know this has a symbol representing the letter C on it. Yet no one knows what it's for yet, mainly because why use the letter C for a button that dictates one feature that could be displayed way clearer with a different symbol? A mic for voice chat would make way more sense, a person symbol for community would make way more sense, a Wi-Fi symbol or some sort of wave would make way more sense for a connection feature. I think the only reason it would be a letter C is because it's multi-purpose, and C really does capture everything it does and works for. It's clear that Nintendo didn't want to show what kind of symbol was on this button in that trailer, which has to mean that the implication of what this button is actually does give Switch 2 a bit of its own identity, that the button is actually the centerpiece of what the Switch 2 is. So what is it? Well, I have a few ideas, some being more likely than others. If Nintendo wanted to do something crazy though, they would do all three at once. But let's start with something a little less exciting, but far more likely. The C could stand for chat, community, or any other word that they will use for their brand new Miiverse-like social media platform for Switch 2. The reason this makes the most sense is because Nintendo has lost a lot of sharing ability once the Twitter ad sharing was removed from the original console. I'm sure Nintendo would want to bring back clips and video sharing in some way, and this would be the perfect time to bring back a social media platform. Having a button with easy access to a community like Social Hub would make a lot of sense, especially if Nintendo is expanding voice chat capability, with the button being a quick way to mute and rejoin a VC. While writing the script for this very video, Nintendo actually updated or published a patent, and again, this could just be ideas Nintendo's thinking about without actually going into them, but it's still things they're thinking about. The patent showed a concept for proximity chat in games, where the volume of the mic is directly related to the distance you're away from a player in the game. This has been a feature for countless games or mods in PC software, as well as a major feature in many other consoles for a while now, possibly even a decade. There's also a rumor, which basically been proven fake at this point, that Nintendo was working on a new social hub called Vidmeo, which would basically be like Nintendo's version of TikTok. I kinda love this idea, to be honest. I think it would be hecka funny, so I'm a believer, and pretending it could be real and telephoning from a legit source somehow, even though it most definitely isn't. I know Nintendo is normally pretty protective of their family-friendly image and how introducing voice chat of literally anyone at all times would likely greatly damage that image. I mean, look at Stage Smash Builder for a few seconds to see what I mean there. But I really do think it's about time that Nintendo stepped on the gas and caught up to the competitors. It feels like it's time, especially if they're doing what I think they're doing with the mouse functionality. A mouse would bring a whole new type of crowd to the Switch, one they didn't really capture the interest of the first time around. PS5, Xbox, PC gamers would finally have a brand new reason to make the Switch to Switch 2. It would bring a really different feel to Switch 2, which is perfect, because Nintendo needs to do all they can do to distinguish this console from the previous one, without removing anything that made the Switch as simple and perfect as it was. However, if they wanted to complicate features just a tad, a bit of the past might be able to help them with the direction to proceed. The Wii U was a crazy flop. It was marketed horribly, the games didn't appeal to hardcore gamers or even big Nintendo fans, and no one really knew what it was. A new controller for $300, an add-on? Why would I need a Wii U when I already have a Wii? It was an idea and name that only brought confusion and fatigue in Nintendo's follow-up at the time. Yet, I don't think the gimmick is to blame for that. In fact, the gimmick is practically what the Switch became, just better. Instead of just taking the screen off the TV, you could take it on the go. It felt like the perfect innovative direction for the next console to take. That being said, there's a lot of experiences that aren't quite possible on the Switch that were possible on the Wii U. And that was due to one thing, a dual screen device through the gamepad. This allowed for really interesting 1v4 games, where only one player could see a different perspective and 4 other players had to avoid the one player. I think it was quite genius, and I think it really deserves a bit more respect than it got. It was a whole new way to play games that only a fraction of Nintendo fans ever experienced. Is there a way we could bring it back somehow? Well, what if C stood for CAS? This function would essentially allow you to wirelessly connect a Switch to the dock to display a screen on the console without plugging it in. It would likely be a bit weaker in resolution to save power on the screen, but this would be a perfect way to incorporate dual screen gaming back into the spotlight without expensive controller or screen add-ons. Dual screen gaming was obviously not just great on the Wii U, but on the DS, DSi, and 3DS. So many games would be able to be brought back by incorporating dual screen gaming, possibly on NSO services or even remakes. More than anything though, I just think that it would be such a Nintendo move to make their most successful console, followed by a console trying to recreate that success while also incorporating the feature that killed its previous generation. Because that's just funny. More functionality is never a bad thing after all, as long as it is enforced, of course. Alright, there's one more thing I can think of that the C could stand for, but if anything is definitely not gonna happen, it's this one. We're going wacky with this idea, and yet still not without precedent. What else could C stand for? Connect, of course, but not just to connect other players or other Switches. Nintendo knows that people bring their phones around everywhere, far more than they bring consoles, and Nintendo wants to get everyone in on the fun. They made a statement that they once wanted every family member in the world to have a Nintendo Switch console. Is there a way they could leverage this knowledge? Well, hear me out. What if you could use a smartphone as a controller? Like a Jackbox sort of situation, except the Jackbox is just certain multiplayer games on Nintendo Switch 2. It's worth noting that Everybody 1-2 Switch also messed with this functionality a little bit, but in a way that didn't really appeal to anyone. Still, it's an idea that has a lot of potential. And why would this ever be necessary, you ask? Well, the new Mario Kart now has the possibility of 24 players. If for some godforsaken reason you wanted to try to get together with that many people and play Mario Kart, that would be a nightmare on the big screen to show. If each player had a home screen they could play on, I think that would be a lot more doable and friendly. It'd basically work like free advertising to the people who don't yet have a Switch 2 to get one. And once again, this idea comes from a patent as well, one filed pretty gosh dang recently. In it, Nintendo experiments with ideas that people could use phones as controllers for gaming. I just think Nintendo expanding to capabilities with phone devices as controllers would be a really neat way to bring the Nintendo experience to basically anyone in the world, and that would be really neat. It's definitely my most out there idea, so I totally understand if you're absolutely bewildered by this one, but I think Nintendo could make it work for them. This is all just wishful thinking, and I'm well prepared for absolutely none of these features to make it into the next console. I just want to present the idea that we truly have no idea what potential this console holds from a hardware reveal trailer, and it could truly be Nintendo's most gimmicky console to date. If that happened, everyone who said, "Why is Nintendo losing their creativity?" in hindsight would look pretty funny. Regardless though, I'm overly excited for the new console generation and the possibilities it could bring, because if nothing else, if none of these gimmicks happen, there's one thing Nintendo still has up their sleeve. Nintendo still got the games! It's time for Rhythm Heaven and Tomodachi Life to make a comeback, boys! Thank you so much for watching this video. This has been a huge project, and was worried I wouldn't have been able to get it done before the actual Switch 2 the actual Switch 2 presentation. I was like giving myself a deadline. I was like, oh wait, shoot, now I actually have a deadline. It's April 2nd. Hopefully you enjoyed. I'm so excited for this new era of Nintendo, and I'm excited for this channel, a new channel, a brand new channel where my brand identity just, you know, a little bit more cohesive. I feel like my previous channel was kind of a hodgepodge mess of everything that was going on, so I'm very, very excited for you to join me on this new adventure on this brand new channel. I have so many videos planned, so stay tuned. That's really all I got. Yeah, till next time, as always, have fun. ThatWanYoshi!